Welcome! So Tim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience here today?
Okay. Hi, I'm Tim Brainard. I'm the inventor and founder of WholeSystem Human, and I always like to refer to myself as a full-time human anytime that anyone asks me what it is that I do. That's the response. I just be Tim as best I can. So there's your brief introduction.
Brief introduction. Well, I actually would love to take it a little bit deeper. Okay. So what is WholeSystem Human? I've dabbled in your site, and of course I know a little bit through our conversations, but if you could actually give us a more detailed overview of what WholeSystem is, what it does, what it helps people with, all those stuff.
Okay, sure. So dabbling in the site makes a lot of sense because it's a rather in-depth sort of experience, even just on the website itself. Describing WholeSystem Human is always a little bit of a trick because it's so individual once you get into the experience of it. Mm. But if I were to pin a word to what WholeSystem Human intends to represent, it is the word experience. There's something about what I have intended to create there that is driven toward bringing the person into their body and into their everyday lived experience in a way that I think is very different from anything that I've personally engaged with in the past. So ultimately what we're focusing all of this effort and work and intention towards within the context of WholeSystem Human is developing a means of sustaining a way of being in life that is elegant and authentic to the individual. So the beauty of that is that as individuals, every single one of us is just immeasurably unique. There's such beauty and depth and dimension to the truth of who each of us is at our core, but accessing that core and then bringing it to life in everyday mechanisms of our experience, that's something special and challenging in many cases, and that's essentially what my work is focused on, helping to tap into and bring online.
One thing I really loved was your use of the words elegant and sustainable. And you know, we love to geek out on the importance of words. I think It's actually how we even connected, right?
You're right.
You would write me these really long responses on a lot of the posts I was generating at the time and just talking about the words. I would love to hear more of your take on choosing those two words, elegant and sustainable, and where those come from and how they have become the cornerstone of what you've created with WholeSystem Human.
Okay, well, I love you for noticing those, and you've really plugged into something that is, as you guessed, not in any way arbitrary for me. These words are extremely important, and they took a lot of time to decide on. I actually learned about the value of words and the way that they connect to us and how they imprint on us through my studies in hypnosis and neuro-linguistic programming and some of these other kind of more psychologically based methodologies. Words have always been important to me as a writer and as a poet and as a musician. There's always something artistic about words, but I had never quite connected how those words imprint not just our minds, but really the very person that we are. We literally live through words. So for me, choosing a word like elegant took quite a bit of time. Initially, the word was effortless. I was working with the idea of effortless power, of organizing the being in such a way that we could move through life or move through an experience or even functionally make use of the body in a way that allowed for this effortless power. So that's what I was getting at with this idea of elegance. But for me, it wasn't so much about the power, it was about the grace, the gracefulness of it. So then there's effortlessness, there's gracefulness, and there's poise. There's something deeply intentional about this world that I was attempting to encapsulate in a word. And when I got the sense for it, the word that continually showed up was elegant. It was actually weeks of the word showing itself to me and me being like, no, that's not the word.
It's too fluffy.
I was like, it's too feminine, it's too smart. But ultimately, of course, I chose the word elegant. And so this is a word that shows up for me time and time again because it has to do with how we organize ourselves and make use of ourselves in real time. So it's something that I intend to live through, and it's something that as I'm working with people, I'm helping them to not just cultivate that in themselves, but really evoke it from themselves, because I believe it's something that's very natural to all of us to move through life in this way that is authentic and elegant. So those two words are tied as well, authenticity and elegance.
Yeah, I actually, as you were talking, I was thinking about how actually there's a very significant difference between those words effortless and elegant. And there's like you mentioned poise, which was one of the first things I was thinking of, like what's another synonym? But also that within elegance there's kind of a power.
Yes.
There's a command there.
Good,
that isn't necessarily in effortlessness, right? Effortlessness it insinuates freedom, right? And kind of like a sense of being able to make choices on a whim and just like that sense of flow. But there's something about elegance that actually holds a lot more power in there, and kind of a lot more autonomy. That's one of my big words.
I like that,
authenticity and autonomy.
Yeah, you're right. There's something, it's almost implicit, like it underpins the idea. It's a ground. I like that.
Yeah.
Your sensory connection to words is very impressive to me. Not everyone has this, but I would love for more people to understand and to really begin to benefit from the value that comes from finding and applying and living through these sort of words.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it comes so much through my meditation work, because in the meditation work that I do, it's about connecting to a feeling when you have an idea of what you're trying to bring into your life. Because usually, like, the things you're trying to bring in are something to bring in a feeling that you feel that you're missing. So that specificity around feeling, you probably already noticed. I closed my eyes for a moment. I was trying to describe what it felt like. And it's because it's been just so beneficial for me to give myself the space to really feel into a feeling, and then to allow myself to feel how a word or an idea shapes feelings.
Yes.
And then I have a lot more clarity around what stuff it is I actually want to move towards, and what stuff I'm moving away from, and what I want to bring into my life more and cultivate and expand, and then what I'm like done with and ready to shed.
Yeah, I love that. So there's something about words then. It's hilarious that we're here to talk about movement, and somehow we're talking about words. This is totally my kind of conversation.
I have a connection there. I have a connection
Oh, okay, perfect. There's something about words that they act as containers on the one hand, and as systems of orientation, or like directives on the other. So you do get to move towards something and away from something else simply by virtue of the way that you're crafting the story. And then finding a single word contains so much. It's fractal. The word elegant is a single word, and yet it just contains all of this history and decisions and all sorts of really good stuff for me. So I love that you already experienced that for yourself. I'm not the least bit surprised.
Well, what I was going to say is, you're like, oh, we're supposed to talk about movement, but that's actually why I chose the word movement, and why this whole podcast is about unpacking the word movement.
Oh, brilliant.
Because the word itself holds so much value. And
Yes.
I love that we got to start talking about the significance of words, because that's how this podcast was born.
Oh, great.
I was talking about movement all the time. I don't actually know if I've told you this story, or you guys this story.
I definitely want to hear it.
So I was posting about movement, and then I realized when I say movement, I have this whole library of experiences and my own internal connections, like the way I map it and see it in the world. And then I thought, that's actually unique to me. And when I say that movement, I have this whole thing that I connect into, and nobody else does.
Yes.
Everybody else has something completely different. So I think by extension of using this word, there's clarity, and there is no clarity. There's actually a lot of ambiguity. So I thought, I thought I was communicating, and maybe I'm actually not. So I posed a question on my Instagram through a video. I asked people to tell me how they would define movement, being curious what was going to happen. And I was actually expecting people to get very literal, and people got very ethereal and esoteric and metaphysical. And I was like, oh, interesting. So, the way we engage with movement tends to be in a very linear, physically driven fashion,
Mm-hmm.
a very limiting fashion. But then when you give a person the word, they automatically will shift to all sorts of different associations that don't have to do with the body and
Yes.
moving through time and space. And so then I thought, that's really interesting that people actually want to go there with this naturally, because I love going there with this. And then I thought it would be really valuable to have a library or like a catalog of discussions that hold space for every person's unique experience and journey with movement, to get
Brilliant.
a sense of what their own like map is with that word, all the connections that they've created, whether it is simply the physical movement that they do, or it's the movement of their life as they transition from careers to ideas and different concepts and different ways of orienting and organizing. And then I actually, one of my first interviews was with a friend who's out in Germany, and she mentioned that in English the word movement holds so much more than it does in German.
Oh, I didn't know this.
Yeah. And then I thought, this is super cool that, we get to unpack it in this language where it means so much, versus if, I was born somewhere else, maybe I wouldn't have had that association with it.
Sure. That's great. I love that technical association, which I think at this point has become the mainstream association, right? And then you're dealing with something so much more poetic in reality as you move that word into the context of our lives. So that's great. I'm actually very impressed that you were surprised to hear those sort of responses showing up. That means that people who are connected to you are connecting to so much more than just how you move.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, that's what I want.
Yeah, of course.
Because that's where it gets fun, when you can engage in a movement practice and then be like, oh, there's this lesson and this lesson, and oh, that thing I did when I was, playing with my movement stuff, now I can play with my work stuff, or like play with my way of interacting people, play with my way of being in the world. I mean, play has been such a significant focus for me these last few months, as you know, and it would not have been born if it had not been generated or planted in my movement experience.
Yeah, that I fully believe. And I believe for myself, that's very much what drew me to your work in the beginning, is the way that you incorporated all of these elements into something as otherwise basic as a Facebook post. So my long responses were authentic. I mean, I couldn't help, but there was like emotion inside of your posts, and I recognized that to be unique, especially since I was paying attention to so many other of these movement categories, and there wasn't quite as much dimensionality to them in my experience, so there was something fresh here. So all of that is to say, I'm super lucky to be sitting across from you, because this is right up my alley too.
Well, for me, like having somebody give me such deep feedback right away was like, it was mind-boggling and then also terrifying at the same time, because it's like, I'm not supposed to get like this cohesive and coherent and also in-depth of response from people. Like, that's not the norm. But it was really exciting to feel so seen and heard and valued for all these dimensions that I wanted to bring across, and I wasn't sure if I was. So that was a real treat for me too.
Great. Well, you nailed it. And continue to. This podcast is right in line with all of that. And this is something you and I love to geek about too, is the way that being inside of our zone of genius creates some special kind of vortex. And it's like you don't need to try to become noticed so much as just be who you are and be interested in the things that you're interested in and be in love with the things that you love. And something about that, I mean, a Tim shows up on your Facebook profile out of nowhere. It's meaningful.
Yeah. Well, why don't we actually take things back into your history a little bit now?
Sure.
Because we do want to learn more about you. What has been your movement journey? And you can feel free to take that big word of movement and chart it through any direction that you'd like. Usually I position this in the frame of body movement.
Sure.
But like whatever movement journey you want to take us on today.
Okay. I would love that. Thank you. It's actually going to be fun for me to think back historically. So if I go to the beginning, I have to say it was probably when I was a very young child, and I remember watching the Olympics, and there were certain categories that always fascinated me as a young child. The first one was gymnastics. I always loved gymnastics. It just blew my mind what people were able to do. And even as a child, I wanted to be a gymnast when I grew up. It was one of those things. Diving was another one. Something about the way that these bodies just moved through the air, it is so graceful. So the gymnastics, diving, and figure skating. And so you can begin to see a theme here, even as a very young child. I was recognizing these expressions of grace, and then not just gracefulness, but also control. There was something about how, in order to exhibit such ease in the body, there was such an immense requirement for control. You used the word command earlier. I think that's the correct word here. And so even at however old I was, I'm not good with that sort of thing, young.
I was a youngin'.
Yeah, even then, everything in me was lit up by these factors. So I think that's where I'll begin. Now, growing up into adulthood, I didn't classically train in any form of movement whatsoever. I was athletic. I loved to play, played multiple sports, but I was never allowed to be a gymnast for reasons of safety on the one hand, and also I think I was a bit more rotund in those days. I was a little porky little fellow. Anyway,
so hard to imagine. Right?
Yeah, right. And so it wasn't until my 20s that I began to take movement as a practice much more seriously. In my early 20s, I discovered the martial arts. And so for me, very much of my history contains movement through various forms of the martial arts. And at the time I was living in Ohio, and I totally lucked out. I found this guy in Oberlin, Ohio, of all places, basically the middle of nowhere, who was highly advanced in multiple forms of internal martial arts. And he was not the sort of person who worked with or trained anyone. He had two guys that he had been training for a period of like 6 to 8 years. And I found him online, and at first he wouldn't even talk to me. And it took a series of communications before he was willing to meet me in person. And then only after that, and kind of getting to know me and seeing how serious I was about learning from him, was he willing to take me under his wing.
Wow.
So I love that it was a journey, even just to access the material that I was able to experience through him. But as a result of working with Jay, I learned some advanced forms of Qigong, and its internal variation, which is Neigong. Those were both deeply effective for me. They mattered a lot. And as I began to develop in those areas, he trained me in 10 animals boxing kung fu, which is just so much fun to say. Every time I say it, there's just like the ego in me. It's like, haha, no one's heard of that before, you know? So horrible, but it was so much fun and so nuanced. And as if that wasn't juicy enough, he also began to train me in Bagwazang, which is even more complex and even more ancient of a form, dealing in spirals. I mean, just really cool stuff. So I was beginning to use my body in all new ways, and then I was beginning to understand the way that my body related to people and to objects and even to the space, I guess, in a whole new way as well. And because these were internal arts, there was a lot more than just movement in them. It wasn't just about moving my arm in a certain way. It was about the whole constellation of effects that occurs there between the interrelation of mind and body and emotion, and just a lot of fun. So moving through those, somehow I ended up in self-defense form of Krav Maga, and I trained Krav Maga for a period of time, a couple of years, and it was basically the yang to the yin of everything I had been doing before. The internal martial arts are very soft, and they have to do with this effortless power. Something like Krav Maga is quite the opposite of that. It's exceptionally functional. It's very basic. It's made to be memorized, and then it's made to show up as like a nervous system response to some kind of a violent stimulus. So in Krav Maga, I was training more sequential movements. I was training ground fighting. I was training knife fighting. I was figuring out how to disarm a weapon, these sort of things. And it was a very different sort of experience from these graceful movements in the field that I was doing with Jay years prior. I should mention Tai Chi, of course, that everyone kind of moves through Tai Chi as they're exploring this sort of material. So this all takes us to maybe, 2015, that time frame. And I was training all of this stuff. When I started, it was about 10 years ago. And then there was a bit of a lull. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I rediscovered my love for the art of martial arts. But I knew I didn't want to do something like Krav Maga. After having kind of held both options in hand, I preferred what I was gaining from the more subtle movements, because there was more depth to what was happening there. So pause while I take a drink of water. Are you okay with me continuing this story?
Yes, please. No,
I always feel bad when I'm on the monologue,
No.
Okay.
This is what this is for.
Okay, great. All right, so this really does take me to some of the most important insights of my entire life, and I love that they are tied to movement and that we get to discuss them here today. Prior to the experience I'm about to share with you, you could think of the way that I was coming at this material as almost on separate tracks. There was something in my way of understanding them that segmented the movement practice itself from some of these other things that I cared about or was studying. For instance, I was studying human health, and that was one track. I was studying psychology, philosophy, belief systems. That was another track. And then, of course, there was a track of my everyday life, which involved and required going to work every day and dealing with people and paying bills. And then, of course, there was my hobby, which was movement. Over time, what happened is some of these tracks started to integrate, where they weren't so separate anymore. And early on, I realized that the work that I was doing in some of these soft martial arts was, in fact, affecting the way that I thought. So there was a way that they were meditative, and this affected my psychology. It affected the way that I experienced life, so they were connected to my philosophies and my belief systems. They were affecting my health. So I'm starting to get a sense for how there's crossover in tracks that I would otherwise segment. But it was never so much conscious. It was just something that I lived into. But a couple of years ago, okay, good, because you already live inside of this integration.
Yeah.
And that's something, of course, as we said, that I noticed in you immediately. But it is not something that everyone is living inside of, and it's incredibly important to live inside of it.
Yeah.
We harm ourselves in a very unexpected way, I think, when we portion ourselves off to these different areas of life. And now I'm going to be the professional, and now I'm going to be the mover. And so we essentially make ourselves smaller to fit roles.
Yeah.
This is also the very basis upon which WholeSystem Human is constructed. This idea that we are total beings, and we get to bring the whole force of that being into any given interaction. It doesn't matter what it is. So this was a lesson I had to be led into through experience, right? And so that's where our story brings us now, because a couple of years ago I discovered another martial art form that's actually based out of Yonkers, New York. And the guy who invented this system is just a pure genius. His name is John Perkins, and the system is known as Guided Chaos. And it's such a ninja system too, because it's cloaked in this self-defense combat system conversation. It's got this kind of like Krav Maga feel about it when you look at it on the face, but inside of it is an art form. I mean, just the most exquisite art form ever. And the founder, John, he embodies the art of this in every step. And it's just unlike anything I've ever seen. This guy is a living master. I initially flew to New York to train with him after about a year in training with the system in San Francisco. And then after a single weekend workshop, I knew that I had to move to the East Coast just to be closer to what was happening.
Wow. So
there's a high level of importance that I place on this material and what it meant for me. At the same time as I was exploring that, I was also involving myself in a very in-depth study on embodiment practices more generally, and how they connect to our experience in life. And I was studying another just master of movement named Peter Ralston. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
No, I have not. But I think like this whole world of martial arts is probably one of the worlds that I'm not as familiar with.
Okay.
Like my dabbling in martial arts was very few and far between. I think my main connection was actually like a few semi-private lessons with Kali stick fighting.
Ooh, that's fun though.
Which was so illuminating for me because as somebody who lives in the space of improvisation and unpredictability and chaos, it was the total, again, if you have a spectrum of just like chaos itself, there's like, or improvisation itself, I think there's like a layer you could have where on one end it's purely fun and creative and playful, and then there's the survival element where it's reactive and quick and you know, for survival. And so I remember going into that being like, this is a totally different way of navigating body and my innate creativity that I've never been exposed to. I should do this more. And then for several reasons. Number one, the person I was working with, this was back when I was working at Equinox, and so when I was fired unexpectedly, I wasn't able to continue meeting with him in the clubs because I wasn't allowed to come back in. So I wasn't able to continue, and he gave me some places to look at, but I was so lost in, you know, building my private business, making it. So that kind of fell off the wagon.
Maybe there's something in it for you then in the future.
I think so. I've been playing around with like where to start and like where my next nugget of inspiration is going to come from.
Well, we're sitting in Brooklyn now, and I don't know the area well enough to determine how far away from Yonkers it would be for you to visit, but and one way or another, I would love to coordinate.
I think I'm going to figure this out.
Okay.
We're going to figure this out.
Yeah, because this system is, and this is a bit of a digression, but it's just, it really is based in everything that you just described. It's really what makes it an art is that it's based in principles of movement. Something like Krav Maga, and keep in mind, these are, when I'm discussing these different things, I'm discussing them through my experience and personal preferences. We're not really weighing pros and cons.
Yeah.
It's not which one's better than the next.
Of course.
Of course, I have my opinions about these things, but that says nothing about the systems themselves. My experience of Krav Maga is, and a lot of the hard form martial arts like this have to do with almost a mathematical quality of function. If someone comes at you with a right punch, then you're going to block this way. There's an if-then, almost programmed sequential way of engaging this information. That's the point of the material. However, when you deepen into an experience of something over time, eventually you have to move past these sequences, and you have to begin to embody something new. And when you talk about survival, the reality is if we're talking about survival on the street, you're not going to have someone who wants to mug you broadcasting which arm they're going to throw a punch with. They may not even throw a punch. They might jump out from behind a wall and just bulldoze you. You don't know what to expect. So what you have to begin training at a certain point is the capacity within yourself to respond appropriately to whatever situation may arise. Now you're in a whole new territory. Now you know nothing. That's the new variable. You went from knowing this was coming, then I do that, to clean slate. Anything in the world could happen. This is the space of chaos. It's a space of improvisation. And how do you even begin to train the nervous system to respond appropriately in those sort of situations? This is an extremely exciting question for me. And that's essentially what Guided Chaos explores, is how to train adaptation in the moment, how to train a way of being in the body at all times so that you're capable of responding to things effectively and appropriately, even under duress. So in my opinion, the problem with segmenting an art form like that to self-defense is you're basically carrying around the fear of being attacked in order to maintain this way of being. I don't prefer to do that. I like the thought of taking the art form, taking the principles of adaptation and improvisation, this creative way of living and moving through life. I like to take that into all areas of life. And so this is essentially what began to happen for me as I was studying this art form, studying some of the greats like Peter Ralston, studying these other embodiment practices. I began to recognize that there's something about how my mind was segmenting movement and the body as separate from decision making and all these other so-called internal aspects of my existence. At a certain point, they just indelibly fused. And at that point is when everything changed for me. I was able to take something that was situated as this hour's training and extend it or integrate it into the everyday movements of my life and interactions of my life. And I was beginning to see how the principles of movement that I was training within the context of self-defense were all of a sudden showing up in the context of relationships and conversation, and all of a sudden the way that I was organizing my body in order to have that speed and that agility and everything in training, I could organize my body in the same way when I was lugging a bag onto an airplane or pushing a grocery cart. It was greater than the corner I had stuck it in, right? And I can see by your eyes that there's so much to add. So
I know.
I want to hear.
You saw I had this wave of electricity come through my body when you started talking
We've
about
got to roll
how it
with
connects.
that.
I mean, I have this love affair with movement and it's just such a rich and deep vessel.
Yes.
And it's infinite in its wisdom. It's infinite in its guidance. And I was having a great conversation with one of my clients, somebody who I worked with for I think close to 4, maybe even 5 years now. And so she started off with me before I was really speaking about this with people, because this was how I lived. And you mentioned this earlier, that my ability to live in the movement and to have it so connected is not common. It took me a really long time to understand that, because this was just so natural to me. This is just how I was, and I was so confused watching people move and be so disconnected from the feeling, or I would watch people compartmentalize, and this was very startling to me as a trainer, coming from dance where the most successful dancers, they lived and breathed in their body. You knew to become a successful professional or choreographer, you had to let it consume you. If you couldn't do that, you didn't have a shot. That's why I fell in love with it, because that was the one place I felt my authenticity. That was the one place growing up where I felt the freedom to be me, because everywhere else I was trying to fit some mold that didn't feel right. So it was my saving grace. But then I get into training and I just watch people this weird mechanical thing of you get to position A in your deadlift and then get to position B at the top, and then you go back to A, and they're not watching what's happening in between.
Yeah, great.
They're not watching the feeling of how the body is shifting and kind of guiding and directing that energy, and what's the quality of that energy.
Yes.
And yet people are reading these subtler signals of movement subconsciously all the time.
Yes.
It's why whenever I train, people are always I'm aware that people stop to watch, and I'm not saying this as because I'm so amazing, but it's but it's because when I come in, I have command. This is my time to be fully integrated. People feel that. It is a language. It's a way of communicating that people are not even aware of, but it's just so innately tapped into our evolutionary biology and how we function. And then to watch trainers not be engaging with that was really frustrating to me. So I was speaking with my client about this yesterday, because she's been one person who, as I've been on this journey within myself, I've allowed myself to share it with her, and she's in her 70s, and she has just become so transformed and lit up in the last year.
Wow.
Because now when we step into sessions, she wants to tell me about all the ways she's been connecting to her body and movement throughout her day.
Beautiful.
And it's no longer this thing of I didn't do my homework, I didn't do it. It's I really wanted to play around with the scorpion reach because I wanted to feel the float, and I don't know if I got it, but it was fun to play, and she's like, I just have so much more sense of my capacity and my freedom that I never thought was possible, and everything just feels so much more beautiful. And I was like,
yes.
it's so nice to watch that connecting moment for people. And if it can happen to somebody in their 70s who's like never really had a strong connection to their body before, it's available to everybody and anybody, as long as you're willing to take a moment to contemplate it and then be able to see and feel into that possibility that like, oh, maybe there's something here that I haven't really given myself permission to lean into until now.
Well, it's the investigative quality. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, it is about play. And I love what you said, where oftentimes, especially early on when we're learning something, we're very focused on getting it right. And so you get things right in the way that you do math. Like I was saying earlier, there's a sequence. Mm-hmm. You do this, and then you do that, and then you do this, and then you look at teacher and you say, thumbs up, did I do good? Mm-hmm. But as you mature, and this is essentially a process of maturation, I believe, the quality of the material deepens, and you begin to recognize more and more nuances in the space between. Essentially what you're developing is sensitivity, but it has to be allowed. So on the one hand, you have to know that it's available, that in between those stopping points that you started with is just an infinity of, you said language, of exploration. There's just so much territory there to be explored. So you have to know that it's available, and then you have to allow yourself to enter that. And this is another trick for the ego. When we want to be very good at something, it's easier to stay on that top layer. It's easier to master steps than it is to step into the great unknown of something that essentially is going to be a lifelong investigation. So you almost have these layers of mastery, but on the level that you operate, and on the level that I want to operate, and on the level that I think we both want to invite our clients and our friends into, it has to do with deepening the experience so that your sensitivity is capable of engaging with all that space in between.
Yeah, and I've been in this place the last 3 or 4 months where I've been really grappling with this idea of structure, and what constraints we put around structure, especially when it comes to exploration and creativity, and also chaos. Because as I've been playing around with the importance of lack of structure and chaos and creativity, I've been getting, whenever I mention this to people, and this has been very predominant, especially in the fitness and now the movement spaces, where it's important to have structure before you have creativity, or you need structure before you go into chaos. And I don't agree. I really don't agree. I continuously get frustrated the more I hear this, because it's a belief. And I debunked this a lot in my social media, especially over my Instagram this week, the fact that these things are a scale. So the problem when most people look at unstructured chaos and creativity, they're looking at it from the scale of like the greatest possibility it could be, total unrestricted freedom. And there's a whole lot of in between there. Like if you're looking at that spectrum, you got the structure and then the chaos. Like you could be incredibly structured and then like loosen it, and then it starts to go into the crazy whatever, but you have all that space in between. So I'm not saying you have to start here, but I'm saying you can start on the other side of that, that top line, and start moving into that creative space, and you don't have to wait till you've mastered structure to do it. In fact, my experience has been mastery of that creative, chaotic component, along with mastery of structure, playing along those scales is actually way more beneficial than limiting yourself to having to learn one to do the other. And I see this as like this, not even just a belief system, it's become a truism. It's just like what people are like, and it's, that's something I'm really interested in debunking, because I think it limits us. It limits our growth far more than we're aware of. And you will not get better at your creativity unless you engage in that skill, and vice versa. Your structure will not be as refined or precise if you are not learning what it means to be outside of that.
Yes. And I have to say that I love how willing you are to put your foot down on that. The minute you said, I don't agree. I'm with you. There's and here's why. Look at how we're already programmed, already trained by life. we've got the left mind structure down pat. Whether or not we have it in a specific area or not, at this point is kind of irrelevant. What we're doing is we're not training systems when we're training these systems. We're training ourselves. We're training the way our minds work. We're training our ways of being in life. This is the whole point of bringing an idea like movement deeper.
Yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, we've all got a pretty good handle on how to sequentially relate to these sort of ideas and this sort of material. In order to stretch the boundaries of what we know, we have to step into this great unknown. And if we're talking about creativity and what is possible for us when we're in that deep well of infinite space that is truly creative space and originality, we're essentially speaking to the very same concepts that I connected to so early on, these concepts of yin and yang, the Chinese, very, very ancient ideas of duality.
Yeah.
So, I mean, without going too deep into this, something that always fascinates me about it is that societally and as humans at this point, we really tend to be more yang. We tend to be more forceful. We tend to be more logical. There's something that's very hard about our way of making decisions, moving through life, and even moving in the body. This is why we carry so much tension. I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. We're literally physically, structurally hard. We're yang all the time. However, yang was never intended to be this holding place. Yin is a holding place. Yin is that feminine, sensitive, soft ground. There's something that's it's funny because it is soft and it is sensitive and it's all of these things, but it's also the ground from which yang, the fertility, can arise. Yin is the womb space. This is where we go into this imaginative zone with no concept for what exists. And
it's like roots versus the tree.
Yes, that's exactly right. But the roots, you have to start there.
Yeah.
And the roots is where all the nourishment comes from. And so in order to have these expressive, beautiful creations, you first have to enter the darkness of yin. And so truly, if we're holding those two in hand and we're attempting to understand where our most beneficial position would be from which to operate in life, it would probably be to center, to root in that space of ease and not knowing and chaos and darkness, the yin space, in order that as the opportunities arise for expression and for creativity and for growth and for conversation and all these different like sparks of light that are yang, we're available to them. If we hold ourselves in the tension of fire all the time, the system just eventually just implodes. I mean, it can't contain so much energy all at once. So I love the way all of this comes together.
Oh my gosh, it's so good.
You'd almost think we scripted it. We didn't though, for the record.
Yeah, always improvisatory. So let's actually take this into kind of the cornerstone question of this whole podcast, which is, what is your definition of movement?
Oh yeah, that's a fun question. So you're the one who really helped me to start to ask this question.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So this is something I've been sitting with for a while. I mean, I had a lot of words that I was working with and I was building roots into, but movement wasn't one of them until I started paying attention to your work. So it's funny, I was even thinking about this last night. I couldn't get to sleep because this question just kept running. And what I came to and have come to over time is essentially that for me, movement is the very basis of existence. Truly it is. Movement is the way that duality expresses itself in form. Movement is the poetry. It's all that space in between. Movement is, it's a flow. I mean, this word is bandied about quite a bit, the idea of flow and the flow state, but truly, once we enter into that space between the sequential steps that we're so used to, now we're inside of something. Now we're inside of a movement. So for me, movement is it's a constellation of effects. It's physical, it's psychological, it's emotional, it's energetic, it's total. We're inside of it every single breath. Literally every breath is a movement. I mean, it's so musical and artistic and just deep and complex in dimension. I love it. We could talk about it all day.
It's symphonic.
Ooh,
orchestral, right? If you,
I'm going to steal that, absolutely.
Well, I love,
It is.
I think for me, where my obsession with movement and how it connects to so much more than just physical bodies in space was actually when I started geeking out about space. Through like the Cosmos documentary with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I love that, yes.
And I you could not pull me away from like all the reading and research I was doing about space. I was so fascinated by it.
You were probably nonstop chills.
Yeah. And then after that, like immediately positioning that to what happens on a cellular, atomic level within the body, and just seeing like this symphonic harmony of life.
Yes.
And the natural motion of life, whether it is on the scale of universes and galaxies, or whether it's on the scale of like the atoms creating molecules and your cells communicating, and it's just so like incredibly complex, but so well formed, and intelligent and beautiful. It's I was even thinking as you were giving your definition of movement, and this is in context of our personal conversations together, where we were talking about the movement of emotion, right?
Okay, great.
Like unpacking what's actually happening with emotions, like how to allow for them, how to flow within them, soften into them. And I was even thinking of the idea of softening into receiving. Because when you're talking about yin and yang, how that's been the theme on my mind, this, the give and take, right? The ability to give and to receive, and how in many ways you are not as practiced a giver if you do not know how to receive. And that's something I've been playing around with for myself. Like, how can I open up and soften to receive, and which I think is more the yin concept, right? To be able to receive versus to always push and give and demonstrate and guide and help. But when can I soften into the ability to receive information, people, thoughts, ideas, nourishment, rest, whatever it might be in that moment.
Wow,
Love.
I'm ready for a nap right this second. It's absolutely true. You're dealing with openness. And this is something that so many of the movement practices that I've really fallen in love with have hinged on, is this capacity to release and to open. And the capacity to do that in your physical body. I mean, this has such a huge effect on who we are, how we move through life, the quality of our health, all of these different things. But of everything you said, the word symphonic is, even now, it's just like running through my head, because I've connected with movement through music. I didn't mention it earlier, but as a musician, there's something about the way that music moves, the way that it can crescendo, the way that a story is told from the beginning to the end of a very good song, the way that the music moves you. And now if you think about this, if we get an image of music on a page, say you have a symphony, and then this symphony is made up of a bunch of different instruments, and every single instrument has their page of music. And that page of music has dots on the page that are essentially telling them which single notes to play. What you have there is very much the more structured, the more sequential, at least visually speaking. You have something that appears to be sequential. And yet it is possible for that instrument to relate to the instrument beside it and the other instrument, and you have a whole symphony of these sequences that create something that is so far superior and so much more complex than any single sequence ever could be. That's movement. And you even have a way that each individual instrument can relate to the notes on its page with emotion. And all of a sudden you have someone who's not just hitting it at the right note and at the right timing, but you have someone who's emoting through the music, and there's even more complexity added to it then. I mean, this is just like, it's fractal. It's just, like you said, there's a microcosm, there's a macrocosm of effects, and we're living inside of both simultaneously at all times. That's what movement is. So then that was the other thought that came to me, is that movement is also about relationship.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That
was already waiting to come out from you, wasn't it?
It's like another obsession of mine this last week of movement is a relationship, and this has been a big thing I've noticed, is people are not in relationship to movement right now. They don't know how to be. It doesn't even occur to them. And then and it's a process to get back into that relationship of
Sure.
it, which is
Yes.
like where I started creating my movement maps. It's like a way to like step back and see what your relationship to it looks like
Great.
in the moment.
I thought those were brilliant.
Yeah, they've been really fun. I've had a lot of people like sharing and giving me theirs,
Love that,
and
yes.
I think on that table somewhere I've got like the more recent one where I mapped out how my movement practice shifted all over the map in the course of an hour based off of my inspiration. So that was really fun. But yeah, like this idea of it's a relationship, and just like any relationship, there's give and take, there's communication. It's something you wanna be connected to and aware of all the time versus just compartmentalizing and shifting into and out of.
Yes.
You're always living within it. Like
Correct. Yes.
what you said earlier, that phrase has been sticking with me, and I think like this is a really profound way of thinking about it. Living within it.
Yes. Yeah, that's the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. There's something about relationship that extends so far beyond any category that you try to squeeze it into.
Mm-hmm.
This definitely applies for movement. And that's, to me, the most exciting part of it. Because until more recently, it's not like I was in relationship with my own body.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I had any concept for how my body was in relationship to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I had a general understanding of how I related to other people, but yet again, these are ways that we compartmentalize something that is intended to be something that we live inside of.
Yeah.
So, it's just, it goes on forever. And this is the excitement that you and I get to experience, and the inspiration that we get to just like have our minds blown about every single day. And it's truly what we intend to communicate to the people that we care about and the people that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
Because the quality of life, the quality of the experience that is possible for the person who really is even getting the slightest grasp on what we're discussing here far exceeds anything that the majority of people are living inside of now.
Yeah.
And that has nothing, I firmly believe that does not have anything to say about the quality of the person themselves.
No.
Because I believe that the quality of and the value of each of us is infinite, that you could just have that for all time and then still having like lifetimes left to explore. But we've made ourselves small, we've been made small, and so the process of bringing all of the things, the languages that we're hearing and understanding and learning subconsciously, bringing that forward, bringing the understanding of ourselves forward, finding that core, and then allowing ourselves to live from it. This is a process, and it is probably the most important process of our lives.
Oh my gosh, that was chills.
Okay,
that
great.
last bit, I was just like, soaking in every word.
Thank you.
Oh, so good. Anyways.
We speak the same language, you know?
Yeah. So let's take this into the next vehicle, or the next arena of this podcast, which is, what are some of the gifts that movement has given you? Or do you have one that's overarching above all of them?
So there have been a lot. I mean, you can kind of get a sense from where this conversation has gone that the whole structure and expression of my own individual life has been completely altered by everything that we've discussed.
Yeah.
So gifts, yes, I love to refer to them as superpowers, because truly prior to this time, it's not like they existed as such. It's not like I was able to make use of half of the internal qualities that I now have access to as like a natural expression of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
But the word that came immediately to mind, although there are a lot that I could use, the first word that came to mind was sensitivity. And when we're dealing in terms of relationship, there's something very special and important about this capacity to be sensitive to all of the various factors involved, sensitive to ourselves and our own needs, sensitive to the other, sensitive to ourselves in space and time and environment. And there's just something about that for me that has been endlessly fascinating to explore. And for every minute of practice and for every tiny little step of progress, there's just so much more to uncover.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it feels like to me. So sensitivity. And there's something for me in that as well about the effortlessness. Because as we become more sensitive to things, we require less force in interacting with them. So Peter Ralston often talks about this idea of doing something as simple as pouring yourself tea, or brushing your teeth. You know, how tightly are you gripping the toothbrush?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a subtlety that is allowed in our physical human experience, and we have yet to really mine the depths of that.
Yeah.
So when we're dealing with sensitivity, we're also dealing with ease. For me, this is what I read into this and what I've experienced. And so there's this constant development of the self as more relaxed, as more at ease. There's more allowing, there's more flow, and it all kind of hinges on this base principle of sensitivity.
You know, no one's actually said that one before.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, and
I love being a first.
I really, I think it's a powerful one because, you know, I've heard awareness has been brought up a lot, which is true, but there's a different dimension to sensitivity.
Yeah.
And like you said, nuance, and you were talking about earlier, like along with mastery is this capacity to like filter into those in-between spaces a little bit more. Also something I was talking about this week with creativity, like there's something really powerful in that nuance subtlety, which is directly aligned with sensitivity, you know? And I think it's very easy for people to get lost in the big picture of things, whether in the macro, right? Whether it's like where you're going in life and what your movement practice is and what your relationships look like, and there's an element of sensitivity that requires you to be present.
Yes,
moment
absolutely.
to moment, right? Because if you're not, you will not catch it. It is slipping through your fingers all the time.
Yes.
So I love that you said that. I think that's a really important.
It's also expansive. So you have to be present, and then the quality of that attention that is possible for you in being present has to expand over time. So an example of that is I remember training Guided Chaos early on, the guy who I was learning from. We had this practice that we referred to as contact flow. And so you would basically like touch hands, and you would maintain connection with one another's hands as you're moving through space. Very similar to like contact improvisation.
Yeah, so I've done that before. It's super fun.
It's a beautiful practice.
So
it's a totally different experience when you begin to integrate like slow motion strikes and things like this. So I always used to get caught by this game. My trainer Steve would play with me, and I would see the hand coming from my head. And I'm thinking, oh no, I'm about to get a karate chop or a punch to the old noggin, you know? And I'm so focused on this that I'm not even recognizing the fist in my gut. And it's not until I'm basically bent over double that I realize all of my attention has been on the hand that's coming from my nose, when in fact I've already been moved by the hand in my gut.
Whoa.
And so as careful as I was to be sensitive, the sensitivity needed to expand in order to encapsulate a greater area, so to speak. And just think about how that can apply to so many other situations in our life, right?
Yeah, I was just even thinking like sensitivity, and you said expand, and then immediately I thought back to what we were talking about with like receiving, and receiving being a state of openness, right? Like that those things they're all connected. Like your expansion doesn't happen unless you soften into the opening, into the receptive mode, and then that's where you can begin to like hold space for sensitivity.
Yes.
Hold space for nuance.
So good. Absolutely, yes. So opening, sensitivity, awareness, all of these words, they have to do with grounding too, because as you're opening, you're deepening, right?
Yeah.
So there's gravitas to this as well. This is that's what I meant by ground earlier when we were talking about that. Truly what I was speaking of was not whether the ground was firm. I was speaking about the gravity.
Yeah.
And so you're unmoved when you can occupy that space. And this is the idea of the monk at the very center of the storm. And so there's chaos and all of these crazy variables and elements and effects just swirling all around him, and circumstances and problems and situations. And there's this person that is completely at ease at the heart of it all. And that's because that person can be connected to this ground or this gravity that you just described. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. It's also the greatest area of possibility that the human being can experience in life.
You know, that's actually a big part of Dr. Joe Dispenza's work, who's, as you know, the person that I've built my meditation practice from. And he talks a lot about like that it's not about like what shifts in your life. It's about the person you become. And it's like when you're the person who can be completely steady and calm in the midst of chaos, that's when you know you've arrived.
Yes.
Right? If chaos doesn't faze you, if everything falling apart around you does not sway you from who you are in that moment, that ability to be grounded and receptive and open.
Yes.
Like that's the true end game of the work, right?
Yes.
It's and I always love that, and I love being able to feel that ability sort of anchor its way into my state of being and become more and more powerful and steadfast with time and with the practice, and then also developing that within all the other practices I work with.
Yes, you can feel it, and there's so many different ways to model it. You've got the sage who models one variation on it, and so maybe the sage is sitting similar to how we are, cross-legged and very calm.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've also got John Perkins, who I don't know his age, maybe he's in his 60s, and he'll have 5 big brutes attack him at once, and there's just the way that he's capable of handling this, they cannot move him.
Wow.
And these are trained fighters, and
Mm-hmm.
he cannot be moved. There's something about this connection to that space that just allows for superhuman capacity. So he's a model.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the person who can experience severe emotion, who can experience deep wells of sadness or even rage, and yet there's something in them that is capable of holding that base despite the emotional effect.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that you and I have also explored quite a bit, and it's obviously super important to every human being alive. How do we maintain that position while in the midst of the chaos that is life? I personally, I have like a love-hate relationship with the word chaos because it's so perfect for the way that we experience things, but I actually find it very beautiful. There's a lot of opportunity inside of chaos once you understand your relationship to it, and that's everything we've been discussing this whole time.
I think if you filter out all the judgment and
Yes,
conditioning around
and
the
the
word,
fear and
because that isn't what that word means to me, right?
No.
But I've taken a lot of time to develop my own relationship
Yes.
with that word, and I watched this special about 4 months ago on the Gaia Network with Ervin Laszlo, who used to be a concert pianist as a child. He was like a prodigy out in Eastern Europe, and now he's a philosopher. And he actually, first 2 lines of this special were about how the universe was born from chaos. We were all
Yes.
born from chaos, and even as children we come into this world living in chaos, right, and lack of structure and creativity. That is our nature.
Yes.
But chaos is it's sort of the room that holds the symphony.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct.
It holds a space for that order, that harmony, that coherence, that intelligence. That is where the good stuff is. That's where the
Yes.
richness is. It's in the chaos, and that's why I love that word. I have a love affair with that word too.
It's so good. It's an expression of the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing that you and I will probably spend the rest of our lives getting excited about discussing,
Mm-hmm.
because it just does not end.
Mm-hmm.
I love that chaos is the room that holds the symphony. I believe that to be true.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've gone on for a long time,
Yeah.
which is great. But let's go ahead and start wrapping things up
great.
here. So I like to finish these interviews and these conversations with words of wisdom. So what would be your words of wisdom for our listeners here today?
Well, aside from listening back to everything Marie has already said, 10 points for 10.
Gold star.
Yeah. I almost always respond to this question in the same way. And it has to do with taking the ideas that we've been exploring here, which at this point only exist as conceptual snippets. I mean, they might even be beautiful ideas, but they're still just ideas. Taking what resonates. Anyone who's listening to this, I encourage you to take what lit something up inside of you and then bring it into the experience of your life. Test it out. Find a way to make it yours and live inside of it for a while to see what happens. Because the reality is that only by doing this can you even begin to get a sense for the reality that we've discussed. And it'll look totally different for you individually than it does for Marie, than it does for me. And that is precisely why it's so important that each of us explores it for ourselves, so that we can continue to create and continue to bring these beautifully original and complex beings that we are online in this life.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my journey. I know that's been your journey, and both of our work revolves around this,
Yes.
like empowering people to be their authentic, unique selves. And there is nothing as profound and powerful as stepping into who you are without any sense of holding back or needing to ascribe to any belief or
Yes.
any format that people have told you have to live in to exist. It is the most liberating thing, and it allows you to step into your own elegance.
Yes.
And what was the second word? I forgot it already.
Elegance and authenticity.
And authenticity.
Yes, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well said. That's the most exciting thing. This has to be experienced. Until it's experienced, it's just an idea, and it can't really penetrate the reality of your life until it's lived into. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Tim. This was wonderful. Thank you guys for tuning in, and that's a wrap.
All right.